I'm here with Larry Behrens of Power the Future. Larry, you're a regular guest on the show. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Thanks, Paul. Always great to be here. Good afternoon to you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And I'll get right into it. We're going to talk a little bit about the state's new ozone regulations. Now, these are, as I understand them, proposed, but disabuse me of any mistakes and tell me why suddenly the state of New Mexico has to impose additional, because there are federal rules relating to ozone. So what's the deal?
Yeah, so I mean, and keep in mind, I'm not a lawyer. I play one on YouTube sometimes, but the fact of the matter is, when the state, it's called promulgating rules, and that's the language for saying, we don't want to pass a law. We think the law that already exists on the books, we can operate under a certain one, and we can send out these rules. Example of that would be, Obamacare was one of those, right? Congress passed a law, but the nooks and crannies of it, the specifics and the details were left up to agencies to promulgate rules. In other words, this is how we're going to implement this law. These are the rules around it. And so it's made to address the finer points that maybe the legislative body did not address in the law itself. The legislative body gives kind of wide parameters. Rules are supposed to narrow it. And generally speaking, it usually happens after a law has been passed. Here's a law, we need to promulgate rules for it. And that's what we do. It is unusual, but not terribly so, when a state government can go back in time and say, hey, remember this law that was passed 10, 15, whatever many years ago? We're going to pass new rules under that law. Usually that's a step that says, we know we couldn't get this through the legislative body, as it were, or it's too complicated to get it through the legislative body right now. So we're going to try to do it administratively. And the process is usually both complicated and simple. What has happened in this case is they have put together what's called a draft rule that says, hey, here's what we're thinking. Here's along the lines of what we're thinking. Give us all your input, public. There's usually at least one public meeting, if not more, or public opportunities where they get to, members of the public get to say, this is bad, this is good, and give all kinds of inputs on the new rule. And then they release the final rule. And that is, after amount of time, quote unquote, the law. That is a new regulation put forth by the state. And so what has happened here with the ozone ones, and I'm sorry, that's kind of a long in the weeds explanation, but what has happened here is they have put out their early rule of what they're thinking, and it's not good for New Mexico.
And just to be clear, was there a law passed recently? I don't recall any specifically on ozone or anything on air quality. Now, in 2021, there was a bill passed to allow local governments to impose more restrictions on air quality. But is this relating to a specific law, or is this just a political priority for the governor?
Yes. And so it is definitely, I would go number 2 first. It is definitely a political priority for the governor. Now, is it related to a law? It has to be. The question is it related to a recent one? You'll have to forgive me. I don't know that one off the top of my head, but every rule has to be tied to a law. And so the situation with a rule is, it can also be undone. If there is a governor that comes in next that feels, or a president that feels that this rule was not right, it can be undone because it wasn't passed by a legislative body. So it's kind of a good news, bad news for those who are promulgating this to say, oh, good, we can do this quicker. We don't have to go through the legislature and we quote unquote get what we want. But the next, state executive, if they don't agree with it, can undo it with a stroke of the pen. And we've seen that happen, right? And so it leads to, and that's one of the bigger reasons that, when we look at like this ozone rule, it leads to volatility. And one second, New Mexico may have this onerous rule. There's a new governor, then they may not. And so doing it in such a way, yes, you are using your administrative power and you get to wave your flag to all your supporters and say, look what I'm doing. But on the other hand, too, it can be undone so quickly. And really the casualty of that is business, right?
Right. Now, of course, we're assuming that this is oil and gas related, and correct me if I'm wrong, but before we get there, I did some research on this because I was just interested in finding out more about the issue of ozone. And it's notable that the American Lung Association, on their website, lung.org, you can find out more about where ozone is a big problem. And they have an analysis of the 25 cities most polluted by ozone. Far and away, Los Angeles, Long Beach is number one, then Bakersfield, California, and a couple of other California towns. Phoenix is actually fifth, not much oil and gas over there. Denver's pretty highly rated in terms of pollution from ozone. No New Mexico city or town is in the top 25. And then if you go to ozone concentration charts, you can find various ones. I found one from the Utah Department of Health, but it's national data. Between 1980 and 2015, there was a 32% decrease in the national average of ozone spikes. This is kind of the thing where on a hot day with a lot of people out driving, there could be a spike. Well, the amount of ozone spiking in the air has really declined dramatically between 1980 and 2015, and I'm sure newer data would have a similar trend. So again, what's new about this? It's just, you're just saying politics, right?
I am. And that data that you just shared is fantastic. And it all points in one direction, right? Mm-hmm. That if you are concerned about these gases in the atmosphere, the best way to slow them down is to let industry take a hold on their own and figure out ways to do this. Now, with this rule, the governor will claim, well, we worked with industry on it. Well, they did get the input, but if you bring out a rule then that is near 100% of what one group says over another, then you can't really say you worked with them. That just means I let you send in some suggestions and maybe I do or don't accept them. But to the science of it, you're exactly right. The fact of the matter is the United States got closer to the Paris Climate Agreements by not being in the Paris Climate Agreement than really any other nation. And let's get to the larger point, because all the stats that the folks that are proponents of this rule never want to talk about is simple. 90% of the greenhouse gases in the world are generated outside the borders of the United States. And if the United States tomorrow cut it off all the way down, we would still not get anywhere near what they say these stated goals are. And so the fact of the matter is that the solutions that they are bringing in place of oil and natural gas development, specifically solar and wind, generate these gases just in a different area. And so you have to start scratching your head and saying, is this about the environment or is this about political positioning? And I would argue that it's clearly it is another way to squeeze tighter on this industry that they want to undermine. And, you and I, Paul, and I think everyone else has seen it in a bunch of other industries. It's a nice little shell game two-step that the eco-left does, radical environmentalists do in New Mexico and across the country. They throw on regulations like this, making the cost of business higher. And so let's look at coal. They'll throw it on their coal, and now it takes more to mine and to use coal in the United States than it did before. And then they'll fight for subsidies for their preferred methods of generation of electricity. And then they'll say, oh, look, the market's decided that coal's too expensive. Well, no, that's not true. You used the power of government and peddled your influence to raise regulations, and that made coal cost more, as opposed to letting the market decide how it's going to work. And that is what we see in this rule. You see in this rule that, it is going to mean that productive wells in New Mexico and the jobs that come with them shut down. It is a requirement that says, they really aren't protecting the small producers in our state. And so I believe in the rule, there is something that says, if the business has less than 10 employees or less than $250,000 a year revenue, then they're exempt from these rules. Well, okay, so if I have 11 employees, does that mean I need to fire someone in order to not have to comply with this rule? It means they also have to hire specific engineers to come into compliance with it. Okay, great, we get to hire someone, but then the cost of producing that product goes up, and then they'll say, well, look what the market's doing. It's causing the cost of oil and natural gas to go up, when in fact, it was these onerous regulations. And so we see this in a whole myriad of ways. The influence is peddled, because I believe this is a political decision. The influence is peddled that artificially drives up the cost of these things. Then they subsidize the ones they want, picking winners and losers. And then they try to convince the public, oh, look, the market says our way is least expensive, when it is really not the case.
All right. Well, these are proposed rules, correct? So what can people do about them if they're concerned?
Sure. I would go to the New Mexico Environment Department website where you can see the draft for yourself, and then you can look at the opportunity to comment. You can send in written comments at any time about how you feel about the rule specifically, what your concerns about it are, and then it is up to the administration of Michelle Lujan Grisham to decide whether or not they are going to take those comments into consideration and implement them in the final rule. My guess is I've called the rule as it states right now a gift to environmentalists because that's exactly what it is. My guess is she'll probably draw it back 10% so that she looks quote unquote reasonable and still throwing this onerous rule on New Mexico and the oil and natural gas industry, which all they're doing is providing energy as affordably as they can to everyone and billions to our state budget. Yet special interests that peddle a lot of influence with the governor seem to want to shut them down.
All right. Thanks, Larry Behrens, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Paul.